Amy Pepiora. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm coming to you from the Trauma and Community Resilience Center. I'm the program coordinator for our Refugee and Immigrant Corps, and my training is as a licensed mental health counselor. And I am sharing time today with my colleague, Martin LaRoche, and I would love for him to introduce himself.
Hi, Amy. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. So I think I just was able to put my slides in there. So first of all, thanks, Elisa, for sharing that important statements with all of us, and I'm so honored to have been invited to talk with you guys today. So thank you for having me here. I am so a little bit about myself. I've been director of mental health training at Boston Children's Hospital at Martha Elliott for over 25 years. And I'm proud of that because it's the oldest standing community health center, and it serves a very diverse community who is in a lot of need. And about myself, I have published 2 books. I need to disclose that as I do receive some royalties from that in a DVD. And I have published over 100 publications or so. And now I'm also associate professor in psychology at the Harvard Medical School. All right, so is it moving, right?
Yes, Martine, do you want to go into the presentation mode so that we can see it full screen?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
There we go. Is that better? Excellent.
Perfect. Thank you.
So what Amy and I are going to be doing today is we're going to be suggesting some ideas on how to use the cultural formulation to get a better idea of what's going on with our kids. And I'm going to be focusing particularly with kids under 10. So to do that, we're going to be talking first very briefly about assessment approaches, a little bit about TSTR, the CFI. When I say CFI, I'm talking about the cultural formulation interview. And when I say OCF, I'm talking about the outline of the cultural formulation. We'll be defining culture and why is it important, hopefully not too long. And then we're gonna be illustrating these ideas with a case. So as I was saying, assessment is basically a systematic process to gain an accurate portrayal of the other person. As clinicians, we want to see who the other person is as accurately, subjectively as we can. And that often requires that we identify symptoms and then allow us to communicate these findings to other clinicians through specific diagnosis. The CFI, the Cultural Formulation Interview, is a mental health assessment tool that does not intend to kind of be like a standalone assessment tool, but it intends to complement other types of assessment tools. I use it all the time on my evaluations. I used it just a few hours ago, an evaluation that I had to complete. You may say, gosh, another interview to complete. Well, Amy and I are going to be giving you at the end some ways to include it with all these different things that I had to complete today in my evaluation. You know, every time I do an evaluation, I have to have chief complaint, history of problems, mental status, diagnosis, the formulation, and treatment plan. Well, I can get a better idea of these things if I have if I use the cultural formulation. And again, Amy and I are going to be talking about how to do that.
So thank you, Martine. So as Martine said, we're going to think and talk about the CFI as a part of the assessment process. So it's in the title. We're going to get to the tool, but first, I think there's some benefit in backing up a little bit and thinking about trauma in the social environment, right? So this is the famous Brafenbrenner slide. I hope everyone has seen it a million times, and yet it really makes sense to kind of ground ourselves in this framework. So this diagram, framework, these concentric circles, right, remind us that youth and their families are situated within larger social contexts and environments. So the ecological systems theory of child development states that the healthy development of a child is shaped by the environment. There are lots of different levels of the environment, and each level can influence a child's development. So everything from a close-knit family or caregivers to peers, schools, etc. So threats or dynamics at any of these levels can impact healthy development. So we can think of the death of a family member. We think about our current environment and school shootings and school safety, the socio-political climate nationally, internationally. So when we're talking about working with immigrant and refugee youth and families, which is the focus of our series and our talk today, we are often, if not always, talking about or considering trauma. We know that there's a strong likelihood that youth and families have experienced at least one traumatic event in the process of migration. So we think about before the experience of leaving one's home, during the journey, whatever that may mean for youth and family, and then during resettlement. In many ways, at any point during their journey, the social environment shifts and changes, whether we encounter family separation, a physical location change, or a change in the way that a new place welcomes or doesn't welcome a family or group of people. You'll hear more about this a little later as Martine shares a case example, but the experience, for example, of the 50 Venezuelan migrants and the circumstances of their arrival in Martha's Vineyard has gained national attention, and it sends two distinct messages about how our society values and welcomes or doesn't forcibly displaced youth and families. So this dynamic, this conversation is part of the social environment around all of us. There's so many ways in which this shifting social environment impacts a felt sense of safety and support for youth and families. So when we think about assessment and we think about this reality, if we use this framework and these guidelines, then it's also true that assessment, intervention, and treatment at any of these levels can also produce positive change for a child. So sometimes social environments respond in ways that are helpful and in ways that are unhelpful. And so our ability to adjust and impact at any level of the environment impacts a child and their development. Next slide, Martine. So if we really accept that this context is true, that this ecological model makes sense for understanding youth and their development and their overall mental health, when we think about assessment, right, we need to think about assessment that includes more than just the youth in a vacuum and their individual symptoms and behaviors. We have to pay attention to and consider the overall stability of the social environment at all levels, which includes the environment's ability to protect youth from real and perceived threats. So we're thinking about how the social environment helps or doesn't help a youth stay regulated, stay in their body, stay present in their everyday life as a part of the youth's assessment and our understanding of the youth's health and mental health. Next slide, Martine. So when we think about, so this previous slide, right, the way that this youth as an individual in their social environment and context is the way that trauma systems therapy and trauma systems therapy for refugees thinks about assessment. So at the center, at the TCRC, we develop and consult around this trauma systems therapy for refugee model. And so the way there's an anecdote or a story or a study that we talk about when we think about how we understand the social environment, and we talk about cat and cat hair. So that is my cat Mo, who is a delight, but is extremely grumpy in this picture. And I think is a nice way to think about talking about this individual, Jack Panskep, and he shed some light about how we think about the social environment. So we're going to use this analogy of cats and cat hair together as a group of providers, as a group of folks who are interested in the care for refugee youth and families, this anecdote might not land well or work for families depending on their cultural experience and worldview. So I'm saying that just as caution if this resonates with you and want to move this forward in your work. Next slide, Martine. So Jack Panskep is a neuroscientist at Eastern Michigan University, and he believes that play is a substrate of the emotion of joy and has an important evolutionary value. He notices that rat pups, like other young mammals, play. So he studied young rats at play, and he had a method of quantifying their play and found that even in lab cages, just as in their natural habitats, these rats play. So in his book, Effective Neuroscience, he reports on his study of these young rats at play. He observes these animals playing for several days and keeps track of the number of play initiations and episodes of what he considers to be rough and tumble play that they display under normal conditions. So then what he does is he introduces what he calls a minimal fear stimulus in the environment, a single hair from a cat. He leaves the hair in the cage for 24 hours and then he removes it. And so the question is, what happens to play after the cat hair is introduced and what happens when it's removed? It's important to note that these experiments are conducted on lab rats, and these rats have actually never seen a cat. So next slide, Martine, will show us what happened. So the y-axis shows the amount of play and the x-axis shows the days. And as you can see, the young rats are happily playing for 4 days. On the day that the cat hair is introduced, day 4, the play stops completely. And even after the cat hair is removed, the play never returns to anywhere near the level where it was when the cat hair was introduced. So we, of course, understand that our human social environments and our human social connections are immeasurably more complex and sophisticated than the environment of a lab cage for a rat. But it's worthwhile to consider whether our need for safety and security is really any different than that of young rats. So when the threat is introduced, even briefly, into a social environment, everything changes. So this experiment illustrates that if there's even a single cat hair in the environment, really nothing else matters. Similarly, if there's a real threat in a child's environment, either a cat hair or like a real cat, right? It makes sense to accept the social environment and to pay attention to assess the social environment. A child cannot possibly attend to anything else if a signal in the environment represents a threat. And so our job as practitioners is to assess the present environment with as much gravity and as much importance as the youth's behaviors and symptoms, to think about history of past environments and how those also impact present environments. Next slide, Martine. So we put this all together, and this is the way that, again, trauma systems therapy for refugees understands the assessment process. So we're thinking about the role of the social environment. We're thinking about the experience of refugee and immigrant youth and families. And we think really broadly when we talk about assessment. So the cultural formulation interview is a tool that helps us get at really important information. But this feels like an important summary or sort of landmarks as we think about what assessment really looks like. So we think about the problem or the focus of treatment, right? What are the concerning behaviors emotionally and physically, behaviorally? What are these problems and to whom are they important? So understanding the viewpoint of the youth and the family each. Do they share the same understanding of the problem? Do they share the same goals? We think about interventions that could be used to address the child's problem. We pay such important attention to strengths, the youth, the caregiver, the environment. And we think also really thoughtfully about what could interfere with addressing these issues, these problems in a child and family's life. The topic of our conversation is culture and assessment. So you may have already arrived at this thinking, but we know that all of this, every green box that is in here is couched in culture. And you're going to hear more about this from Martine. The understanding of strengths and barriers can be incredibly steeped in culture. How we build a relationship, what is a relationship, right? How do we understand the benefit or not of mental health treatment? All of these thought bubbles in orange highlight the level of assessment we're going to be talking more about as well. We need to understand how a youth and family understands what is happening, how they make sense or don't make sense of their own story and context, how they understand healing. These considerations are key to understanding, to asking and learning about if we're going to move forward in a treatment way or model or intervention that feels meaningful based on the cultural views and understanding of our youth and families. Next slide, Martine. So if we said it once, we've said it a million times. If we can move forward with an assessment that integrates culture, that really looks at the role of the social environment on a youth's development and well-being, we shift our lens, and hopefully the lens of the other adults around this child, from what is wrong with this person to what has happened or what is happening to this person. Thanks, Martine.
Thanks, Amy. So Amy made it many very important points, and what I want to just highlight that many times that standard traditional assessment strategies often highlight a lot the individualistic factors. That is, they try to see more the individual in isolation rather than context. And they try to see more what's going inside the person rather than in connection to others, and not embedded within specific places and time. And just think about many of our mental health goals. When we think about them, we think about, for example, increasing the child's self-esteem, self-efficacy, insight, individuation. All of these are processes that reside in the individual. And the DSM-5 tends to do that quite a bit. What we are trying to do is complement these factors with a cultural and relational perspective. We're not saying that individual aspects are not necessary. They're crucial, they're essential, but we also want to see how culture is playing a role in what we are seeing. I think that relational factors have been growing in importance. I think the feminist movement has done a wonderful job in identifying how relationships impact the way we see ourselves and connect. And I think that when we do an assessment, it's pretty clear that if I'm in a grumpy mood, people may not want to respond well to me. They're gonna be, no, who is that? It affects that. But even more, our level of cultural competence. And that's why Amy and I want to emphasize this idea of cultural humility, that we don't know it all, that we're always just in process of learning more, of trying to see who the other person is. Remember how we started with trying to see who the other person is? Let's be humble. Just because I am from a specific background, just because I'm Latino, it doesn't mean that I'm always going to be late. It's important to kind of see who the other person is and explore and listen to that person. And then the cultural factors are also have been increasingly to be found important. And we're going to be talking more about how the place and time in which the assessment occurs and the cultural meanings we have a significant impact and how we understand people. This figure here is basically emphasizing how we need to take into account all three elements: individual, relational, and cultural. Many people would argue, no, individuals are more important. But what we want to emphasize here is that they're not independent. Sometimes what we see as relational can be cultural, individual also, and that's kind of what we want to highlight with this figure. I think that there's, when we think about cultural competence, there has been a significant change more recently. In the past, it was that we were supposed to develop very specific skills on how to work with Latinos, with African Americans. And thank goodness, more recently, the concept of cultural humility has been much more in the forefront. And you want to say a couple of words, Amy, about it?
Yeah, I think that cultural, again, sort of this move from cultural competence to cultural humility or cultural responsivity sometimes is the language. It doesn't remove the burden, right, or the responsibility as a clinician to do my research, right, to know basic information if I'm going to sit with someone who comes from a different place than me, who has cultural norms and values that might be different than mine. However, it's not a stagnant checklist process, right? So it's a stance towards engaging with other fellow travelers in the world. And it's a values-oriented approach focused on increasing connection, right? And dismantling oppression. So Martine, I love where you just went, jumping right ahead. Right? Cultural humility is a place we're always trying to get to. We will never fully arrive. So we're committed to self-evaluation and self-critique. We're recognizing and acknowledging and hoping for changes in power imbalances in relationships. And we're working as individuals and professionals and humans, right, to develop mutually beneficial partnerships with communities and working towards institutional accountability. So again, we think about the social environment as more than a youth and their family, that there's a larger context. We as well are part of that larger context. And so the way sometimes that we can intervene is to situate ourselves and think about shifting a social environment in different ways. Thanks, Martine.
And there's been a significant shift. The recent kind of guidelines that the American Psychological Association proposed or published were all more based on cultural humility than cultural competence. It's defined very differently these days. So this is a very, I think, timely inclusion. So I'll talk very briefly, I hope, about what is culture and why is it important. I think that we all know this. And this is the standard, very kind of well-known definition of culture, a systems of knowledge, concepts, rules, and practices that are transmitted across generations, includes language, religion, spirituality, etc. The bottom line is the culture has like two specific dimensions. On the one hand, we have the common subjective cultural meanings that different groups make. So that is that specific groups tend to construe the world in some ways. And I say that, and I want to just remind all of us about intersectionality, that there is many groups that are interacting. It's not just because of race or ethnicity, it's also about religion, socioeconomic status. There's much complexity on all these different groups that construe meaning. And the other one is the time and place in which people make, in which the assessment is happening. Just imagine those migrants from Venezuela who are now, right now, in Martha's Vineyard. It's very different the way they're going to be responding to the mental health assessments that are there than than how they were responding to in Venezuela. So, and I think that literature, and this quote here is just because I think that literature is, in many ways, is much more aware of these truths. And just when you think about Don Quixote de la Mancha, which is the first classic novel, this is how it starts. It starts with the time and place, somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember. So I think that literature has been very much aware of this, and only in psychology and mental health practices, only more recently, we have started to rediscover the importance of culture. And I think much of this is partly due because of the efforts of many different mental health providers that have very recently identified how culture shapes in so many ways the way people seek help. The way they construe their symptoms is shaped by culture. but also we mental health providers have our own culture in which we perceive other people's problems through those lenses. And sometimes when our meanings don't match those of our patients, we end up construing those differences not as cultural differences, but as deficits, as psychopathology. What happens then? That many times the symptoms of racial ethnic minorities or different religions are frequently over pathologized. It happens all the time. And if I was able to see, raise your hands. If you've seen this happen, I'm sure that most of us would raise our hands because it's so often when we work with different groups that we have our own meanings, and we when we don't see those in other people, we end up seeing these differences of pathology. Unfortunately, it's not only that. If I'm unable to see the other person, then I'm not going to be able to construct, I'm not going to be able to design a treatment strategy that responds to their needs appropriately. Since I'm not seeing them well, how am I gonna actually create a plan that meets their needs? So I'm not gonna be able to treat them as effectively if I'm not assessing them more fully. And what happens? Many times if people don't feel seen, they won't trust our services and they won't come to see us. So those are very typical problems. And I've been talking a lot about uh, cultural differences, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of the typical differences that we might find. I will emphasize, I will start by the ones that are prevalent in the United States. Individualism is very common. We assume that who we are is defined by our own characteristics, our self attributes, the way we see ourselves. But that's not the case in many groups. They define themselves through relationships. What does that mean? You ask them, who are you? And they will say, oh, I'm the son of Carmen. I am the brother Jose. And rather than saying, oh, I'm a smart, outgoing person, which is the more typical individualistic kind of way of defining yourself. So it's a very different way of understanding yourself. And what happens if you respond, oh yeah, I am, who are you, Martina? Well, I am the son of blah, blah, blah. Then what that means is that I'm going to be seen as less mature, less competent, uh, less aware or individuated than other people. So that's what tended to happen. And in fact, so much so, just brief example, that in the past, some very prevalent psychoanalysts would say, no, we cannot work with Latinos because they're not mature enough. They don't have the self-awareness to work and analysis. That was a very common statement that used to happen some time ago. Competition. If in this culture, we're supposed to strive and do our best and kind of get the best grades we can. In many other cultures, not like that. What really matters is to help each other. Spirituality is very important in many different cultures. The world is seen. There's a spirit world that sometimes guides you and tells you what's going on. Not so much in the United States. In many other cultures, kids are taught to respect and be very obedient towards their elders, and sometimes less so here. The family structure, it's often assumed to be the nuclear family, not necessarily in many other cultures. It's not only about coming from the same blood, or it's also having good connections with different people and that live with you or have been close to you. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Gender roles and identity might be more fixed in some groups and than others. And language is a huge one. And I wish I had time to talk about language, but it's very important to talk to connect with our kids in the same language, even though they might not know they might know English, but the reason is because words are not just dictionary cognitive meanings. Words are loaded with emotional meanings. So what I'm trying to say is that someone may be saying a word and you know what it means, you know that right translation, but it may have a lot of different emotional meanings in one language than another. And not only that, once you start going and to those associations and to that, you might actually be able to kind of get into much deeper or different information that you would if you ask the person in one language. So language can be a really important source to get more complexity into people's identity. I guess the best way I could describe this is as a kid who said to me, when I talk in English, I feel like a different person than when I talk in Spanish. That's how significant and powerful it is. It's not only about the translation. All right. So uh, you can see as Amy Brenner's kind of chart here because it's so important. Um, but the bottom line of what I want to say here is that uh, culture affects also the development. It's not only biology. What that basically means is that uh, early on, children start kind of presenting some uh, uh, characteristics that are culturally framed. So much so that you hear about Piaget's famous stages, right? You have the concrete stage, formal operations stage, and all that. Well, guess what? They emerge at different times in different cultures because culture is so powerful that it affects when they emerge and the way thinking uh, uh, expresses itself. So what I'm basically trying to say is that early on, and I would say kids are highly influenced by culture, and perhaps even more so than adults. And kids are exposed to multiple contexts and very powerful influences. Unfortunately, the voices of kids have often been neglected, uh, in the cultural literature. Not much work has been done to hear them in a culturally sensitive way. It's a challenge. There's much we need to do to hear them more appropriately. And this is very, very important because as Amy was saying, uh, the way it's kids kind of connect and kind of express themselves, not so much through words, like in talk, but often through play. So we need tools that allow us to connect with them as we play with them in a culturally sensitive way. And it's hard to understand kids without their families or cultural groups. Um, so these are some of the tools that we most often use to connect with, to do play therapy with our kids. Drawing, I think puppets have come a long way, and figures that they're not only white anymore, thank goodness. Play-Doh can be extremely helpful. But one example that I love sharing is the doll houses. If you look at our offices, how many doll houses do we have? If hopefully one, right? exactly. Well, what the assumption underlying that is that the kids live in only in one house, maybe just one nuclear family. What I have found, thank goodness for, because one of my students left an extra dollhouse in my office, and when the kid came in, I had two, and that was amazing to see him play, jumping from one dollhouse to the other, and um, and how much more information I was able to get because he was reflecting the more openly the complexity of his lives. So I'm basically trying to say that our play therapy tools are also shaped by our cultural assumptions. We need to keep questioning them, and so that we can be more open to hearing the kids' voices. I love, I hope, I'm not sure you can see this, but I always encourage people to remember these 8 questions. I'm not going to go into all of them, but if you can, please have access to them. I use them all the time in every single assessment I can. Um, and I think they are more and more common these days. Arthur Kleinman, who is one of my heroes in the literature, in the cultural literature, was the one who proposed these 8 questions. And they're based, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them. And this is, what are they calling the problems? This is my adaptation of these questions. I changed the pronouns to make them more sensitive. He in 1988 basically said, "What is he calling? How what is he calling the problem?" So I just felt uncomfortable. I wanted to make it more open. So what are they calling the problems? It basically refers to we want to hear what the problems are or what the issues are for them. I sometimes, like today, I said, okay, so why are you here? What can I do for you? It's not so much a problem. It was just like saying, trying to connect with that person and seeing what I could do, what they needed from me. And this question might seem very, very simple, but I think it has opened many different doors for many people to hear what actually people want. In the past, often when patients came in, we make assumptions that what they want from us is for us to deal with the depression or anxiety that we might be assessing correctly, but that's not really what they want. So we want to hear what they want so that we might be able to give it to them. All right. So I also want to highlight, I'll go in more into that in 1 minute, but what do they think the problems, what do they think caused the problems is also very important because it allows, uh, if they think the problems are caused by some sort of witchcraft, then when the psychiatrist comes and offers them medication, they're not gonna take it because why are they gonna take the medication if it's all like a witchcraft spell? So it's important to understand these things so that we can frame it in appropriate terms. I love question number 6 also, and I use it all the time. What kinds of treatments do you think you should receive to get better? I basically don't ask like that. I basically say, what has helped you? And so I can use those assets as a way to design my treatment plan. And in my example, you'll see how I use it more clearly. Okay, so this is the outline of the cultural formulation, and this was initially placed, the outline on the DSM-4R. How many of you knew that? Probably none. Why? Because it was placed like in page 853, I'm making it up, of Appendix 9. It was like buried in this DSM-4R. The cultural formulation It's now on page 749 to 57. It's a little more prominent, and it's in the section 2. It's not no longer an appendix, so it's more prominent. And that was like a significant statement, basically in the DSM-5, saying this is important. Let's pay attention to this. The cultural formulation interview is an updated and revised version of the outline of the cultural formulation, what I just these questions here. And it basically makes it much more, it asks more specific questions of how to ask the 8 questions of the outline of cultural formulation. And it intends to expand what counts as clinical data in the clinical encounter. All right, so there's 2 versions. So this is important. One that assesses the individual directly. You're gonna administer to the patient, and the other one is the informer version, in which you basically try to get other people who are highly involved with that client to provide information about the identified patient. So, and you can get as many CFI informant scales as you want, which is a great thing because you can get a lot of more complexity in that way. You can use it with with the teachers, with the parents, with the grandparents, whoever. The more information you'll get. Of course, there's some time limitations on that. There's 12 supplementary modules that can be used in addition to these to the CFI. So, for example, if you're interested in getting more information about identity issues, you could administer the identity module. Like if there are refugees, you can use the refugee kind of module. Unfortunately, there is one module that's for kids over who are teenagers, usually around 13. So what that basically means is that cultural formulation itself, it's very difficult to administer to a kid himself, herself. And I'll explain why, because the questions they ask are not at the right cognitive level for kids to respond appropriately. So it's better to ask the informer version to the parents or teachers, and then kind of use an adapted version with the patient. And that's where I come in. What the work that we have done is basically adapting a version of the CFI for kids so that we can get more direct information about what they're experiencing. The cultural formulation has 4 areas, which are similar to the outline of the cultural formulation. First, definition of the problem, the perceptions or the causes of the problem, the factors that affect self-coping or past help seeking, and cultural factors affecting current help seeking, and what kind of help do you think do you think you need? My memory is not that good, and I can't remember all of them all the time. So what I do in my mind when I'm using this, what helps me is what is the issue, what is the theme, which is basically kind of trying to understand more what the theme, kind of the chief complaints is, what caused it, what's the past, the history, how is it being dealt at this moment in the present, and how could it be better, the treatment, what the future could be looking like. What's wonderful for me about the cultural formulation, it not only allows us to see and explore self-esteem issues or factors inside the person, but also allows us to include many family, school, community institutions, and hopefully, so, if I have time, we even the spirit world, ancestors, and the therapeutic relationship. It's a very nice way to include all these different elements in a way that allows us to hear more clearly the voice of our kids. Now, these are some things that I always encourage people to know before administering the cultural formulation, particularly with kids. Read them carefully. Not only the cultural formulation, but also the outline. Understand as much as you can the culture, the context of the child. Have an idea of the development of the child. I'll always explain the limits of confidentiality when we're going to be meeting, and make it very clear. And before I go into before I ask any formal questions, I try to establish a sense of rapport with them. I'll often start with very specific and gradually make it more complex. Very important. When I'm with kids, I try to have fun. If I'm cold and distant, I'm not gonna go very far. Then just make them feel comfortable, enjoy, be with them. That goes a long way if we're able to connect with them in the family. I often start first with the guardian or the parents, applying the CFI informant version, which is the same 16 questions. I'll hopefully be able to show you some of them. I ask them to play or draw sometimes, or with the dollhouse, puppets, and often I prefer, like I said, remember these questions, look at them, and try to incorporate them in the conversation. But I often try to follow the flow of the child's talk, and then I kind of jump in when something else needs to be said. And okay, so what about you? Are you sleeping okay? I kind of explore some more when I have an opening to those issues. Sometimes I'm talking to third person. Zoom has been a great, when I have used a Zoom, has an advantage. I can see their homes and see what's important for them culturally. And I try as much as I can to apply it also with the teachers. All right. So I know I talked a lot, and I want to try to illustrate these ideas with a case. So this is, and I'll be, again, trying to illustrate the CFI for children, and it's going to be a composite case, a combination of different cases. And because as a way to keep the confidentiality of the families, and I'm also changing a lot of the information, of the identifying information of these families as a way, again, to protect their confidentiality. I met this family during the pre-pandemic era, and during Trump's it occurred while Trump was president. I worked with this Venezuelan family for a few months until they moved to a different town. I will call the identified patient Joseito, who presented with his mother to the clinic in which I work. The clinic has a reputation in the community of helping the underserved and assisting those who are at the most need. Joseito presented as a well-groomed boy with a very shy smile, very bright dark eyes, and thick, curly, shiny hair. He was appropriately dressed for the fall weather, and as I said, he was born in Venezuela 6 years ago. He preferred to speak Spanish, and his English was limited. The sessions therefore occur in Spanish. As you may have noticed, my English is my second language, and I too am Venezuelan. It is important to say that when I start assessing young children, the first thing I do is I meet with their parents. And I don't address any of my many diagnostic questions until I feel comfortable with them, until we have established some rapport, which is what I did with this case. I started talking with Joseito's mom, who I will call Dora, who is a slim, black, very energetic woman who seemed to be in her mid 40s and talks very intensely as she eloquently gesticulates with her hands. She was amazing. She seemed to say so much more with her hands than with her words. I started by asking Dora which buses had she taken to get to the clinic, but soon she asked me where I was. And I responded, I'm from Venezuela, and added, I came to Boston over 30 years ago. Immediately, she started out talking about Venezuela, current political and economic collapse. She said they had left Caracas over a year ago because they were hungry. Um, they could not get enough food, and adds that during the last year, 2019, Dora lost almost 9 kilos. That's about 18 pounds. On average, on that same year, the average Venezuelan lost 15 pounds because of the level of starvation that was going on. She added that Maduro's dictatorship has ruined the country. And in fact, the dictatorship has become more repressive and violent, having crushed all opposition. Given this level of repression and hunger, it is not surprising that since 2016, over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. Currently, there are Venezuelan refugees all over the world, even in Martha's Vineyard. The family had lived all their lives in El Barrio 23 de Enero. This is 23 de Enero in Caracas, Venezuela. This barrio is known as one of the most dangerous places in the city, and perhaps now in the world, as Caracas has now become one of the most violent cities in the world. Uh, the, the number of murders is one of the highest in the world, and that is reported murders. It is so violent that the police does not venture into it unless it goes in large numbers and with armored vehicles. Nevertheless, Dora says she could get food, just, but it got worse after 2018. Barrios are usually run by gangs, and usually there is not many services in them. After a few minutes about talking about Venezuela, I realized that Dora was now feeling very comfortable with me, and that I could move to ask more about Joseito, that I could start asking about him. So I asked kind of like the first questions, how, and I can't remember exactly how I said it. So what probably it was something like, what can I do for you guys? And Dora said, Joseito is the youngest of 6, el consentido, which means the spoiled one. He has 3 brothers who are 10, 12, and 17 years old, and his sisters are 15 and 8. Jose and she added, Joseito has a good relationship with all of his siblings and me. His father left home over 5 years ago, and he had very little contact with them. And then so what's going on now? And Dora said, my oldest son, Pedro, was shot in front of our home. He was not doing anything. We're just so lucky that he survived. He received 3 gunshots, but we're worried that it will happen again. Dora then explained that there are frequent shootings in the neighborhood, which is making the whole family very, very nervous. And then she goes and says, "What was Pedro shot? What what was he doing? He wasn't doing anything. He hasn't hurt anyone. Is it because he's black or because we're Hispanic? What's you know, very confused." And then she adds, "It's like living in a Tres de Enero, but worse because we got no one here." Um, and she kind of asks some more, and she says, since the shooting, Joseito started having nightmares, and he's not eating at school. I think he's looking thinner. Dora explains further that after the shooting, Joseito has never been the same. He's not even playing with his friends. I asked how he was playing with his friends before and after the shooting, and Mother responded, before the shooting, he never seemed afraid of going out, but now he seems afraid of walking alone in the street. And she identified his nightmares, poor appetite, and fear of walking alone as the most troubling aspects of his behavior, which was in response to question number 3. However, I asked many additional questions to around this time to get a much more clear mental status. So it's like you use the cultural formulation, but you can keep asking more about different aspects. In exploring the cultural perceptions of which are 4 to 7, or the causes of these issues, according to Mom, Dora explains that the shootings were the causes of Joseito's problems. However, and this is very important that I hope we can all remember, it makes sense, right? The shootings are creating all these different issues. But later on, after she felt more comfortable with me, she said also to me um, that the people in her barrio were jealous of her because she had actually made it into the United States and she was being successful. And they were envidioso, and they had envidia of her, jealousy of her. So they had put un trabajo de brujería, a magic spell on her that would harm that family. So that's the other part of this, that they were thinking that there was a there was a brujería on here, and that was also going to be important to address. And that's one of the advantages of the CFI that allows us to get much more specific information of what might be going on. Uh, so I try to explore more what the violence and Joseito's symptoms meant for them, and Dora explained, Americans do not care about Latinos or Blacks. They don't even know where Venezuela is. So they just dump us all into a bloody neighborhood so we kill each other. Isn't that what Trump wants? He wants to get rid of us all. Having experienced much discrimination from white people in institutions in Venezuela, there's a lot of discrimination in many Latin American countries. It's not only here; it happens a lot. Um, and she began to talk about it, and I fear that given that I might be seen as a light-skinned clinician, she would not be open and trust me. So I wanted to bring it up, but she immediately jumped into something else, and she moved to talk about housing issues. And she explained that she was trying to move out of the neighborhood, but she could not complete the housing applications. Um, which allowed me to kind of explore more questions 11 and 13, kind of what kind of some of her self-coping and also things that she had done in the past. And I'm trying to go a little bit faster because I know we have only a few minutes left. So, and also I also noticed that a lot of she would refer to them, more as a family than as an I. So it goes back to this understanding of that many Latinos and other culturally diverse groups have as relational. Uh, so it was more a we rather than I, and her sense of self was seemed to be composed most of relationships than self attributes. Uh, so I immediately thought, okay, I gotta refer her to a case manager. And I started saying that. And even before I finished my sentence, she interrupted me and said, case managers are useless. Huh? Uh, and she explained that her previous case manager was a very busy woman who did not seem to have time for her or her family. And Dora explains she was just like most white people who don't seem to care about me and my family. And again, her question was an opening for me to explore more about race and ethnicity and power differentials. Again, even though we are both Venezuelans, I may be lighter skinned and she may be darker. I'm more educated and had lived a long time in Boston and she's just arriving. And all these complex differences could also be construed as power differentials. And it was important for me to address them and talk about them so she could also question them. She could also be able to say, no, that's not how I'm seeing it, and be able to set more clear limits with me later on. So I asked her, what can we do so all these injustices that she had already told me about don't happen here with me? And she said she was already calling me Martin. Martin, um, not Dr. LaRoche. Martin, I hope well that if I have a concern, I can bring it up. Please do. And then she added, you need to care about us. What does that mean, Dora? What does it mean that I need to care? Um, well, you really need to try to listen to us and see what we need. I'll do my best. But what if I don't? Then I'll tell you. Okay, thank you. Will you really tell me, Laura? Yes, I will. I will. So that was an agreement. And many times when she was able to tell me these things. And I think that was very important that we were able to do that, or else all these differences may have created mistrust that may have hinder her ability to remain in treatment. So finally, she was trusting me more. She seemed to be more able to listen to me. And I said, um, can I meet Joseito, please? You know, Joseito is the spoiled one, the consentido of the family. And so finally, I was able to meet him. And Joseito came to the room looking to the floor, very shy. But I realized he was looking to the floor out as a sign of respect towards me. It's not that in many cultures, you are taught to look not to look to elders as a sign of respect. And that's what Joseito was doing, I saw. And I would think so more because later on he would really he would be able to look at me and talk and ask me questions, etc. So I asked him if he wanted to build something or play with Play-Doh or draw something. And he immediately took some paper and crayons and started drawing 4 thick walls that looked like a fort. He drew his family. Let's see first. He drew his family and himself inside. Um, and his father and grandmother um, are in Venezuela. And he stated that he's playing with his family inside and that all is good inside, but bad outside. Outside, one of my brothers was shot, and I'm afraid that it will happen again. I'm scared, he said. Joseito then talked about having nightmares in which he was repeatedly shot or kidnapped. Again, he said, I'm scared. Tell me more about how it feels in your body to be scared, I said. And he said, my heart beats very fast. It's hard to breathe. I feel that something bad is going to happen. You're scared of another shooting? And Joseito nodded. In later treatment sessions, I will work on this pattern that he would hear anything that reminded him or was similar to a shooting. And going back to Amy's cat example, the cat hair, every time they saw the cat hair, they would be terrified and be very nervous. That's what Joseito was doing. He was fearing it would happen again. And treatment later on, we worked on making this, kind of breaking this pattern. I also asked about eating because mom talked about it as a very prominent, important thing. And as he continued to draw, and then he played happily with both houses. I asked Joseito what had helped him in the past. And he said, being with my family makes me feel safe. And so also it helps me when I read the Bible. I'm using question, remember when I was talking about the outline of cultural formulation, question 6, about what helps the family. So I was trying to figure out what kind of assets they have, what can I use to make them feel safe. So Joseito told me about the Bible, about praying, and then with mom, we talked about a plan that whenever Joseito felt kind of nervous, anxious, his heart was beating, etc., they would pray together as a way for him to calm down and be able to manage his symptoms better. Mom said, yes, that's a good idea. And then she said, that will get rid of all the bad spirits of mal de ojo que nos hicieron. They will get rid of the spell they put us on. So that's why we will do it because of that reason. And they started doing it. They were complying with the treatment. Every time they were scared, they would start doing it, and gradually Joseito would feel more comfortable. Unfortunately, I could not assure him, Joseito, that more shootings would happen. However, we would talk about plans to protect her family. Additionally, we also were able to get the family, a case manager, to help him move into a different setting as well. In this case, and what I did is that I went to the first meeting. I went with them, and Joe was this person together with them, and this person, the case manager, was amazing. The first day, she was able to get them food stamps, and completed a lot of housing applications, and she was just a powerhouse. But I would always check with Dora and ask, how's it going with this person? And she's good. Is there anything I can do to help? No, she's good. She's really helping us out. And that's what happened. After a few sessions of treatment, Mother explained that God was giving them strength to cope with all the problems they have had. And Dora and her family were adhering very well to our treatment plan. I thought that they were adhering very well to a culturally adapted TSTR intervention. In my mind, I thought Joseito was suffering from PTSD symptoms. He had all the 8 cluster symptoms, and had witnessed and experienced a lot of traumas, not only in the United States, but perhaps also el 23 de enero, and the whole crossing of the border through Coyotes. So Joseito had experienced all these different issues and all these difficulties that range from Trump's racism to Maduro's dictatorship, living in violent neighborhoods. But nevertheless, I was hopeful that dealing with TSTR and cultural psychotherapy, focusing not only on the individual, but the whole family, the context, and the history, we were able to provide and continue to help Joseito and his family. Thank you.
Thank you, Martine. If you want to stop sharing, that would be amazing. We can get some faces on the screen. I know that before I turn to Alicia, Martine, you were moving back and forth between the story and these slides. I just want to remind people that you'll get a full version of the slideshow, so you can see sort of in order the slides with the questions to potentially ask, how to adjust for youth, and then we've also included a link to a table that summarizes all of this work that Martine has done. So I'm going to turn it over to Alicia now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you both for such an excellent presentation. I just had so many thoughts, really resonated with me, and I am so appreciative for your work. And I have to say, the case presentation really kind of illuminated a new level of getting information. And so thank you so much for that. So I have lots of comments, but we also got lots of comments and questions from our audience. So I think people were really thinking about this and how to incorporate it in their work. So one of the questions that came in was wondering about the informant version of the CFI and whether it could be used with a family member who does not live in the United States, but rather is back in the country of origin. So if communication is possible, because a lot of youth still communicate with their families, and is that possible?
That's a great question. Absolutely. And apologize, I know I rushed at the end with a lot of different information, but yes, that's one of the advantages of Zoom, that you can have a hybrid session if you want. And you can include people from different parts of the world, and it's happening more and more.
Isn't that awesome? I know technology is really valuable in many ways, right?
Yes.
So along with that question, another audience member said, how does using interpreters impact the CFI assessment, the interview process with children and caregiver, versus the interviewer being fluently able to speak in their preferred language?
Yeah, no, I think that interpreters can be extremely helpful. What I would encourage you guys to do if you don't work with an interpreter is talk with the interpreter before, have a little bit of the connection with that person, so you can plan how the session is gonna happen. So what happens is that then the interpreter becomes the center, the middleman, and then the therapist might become more like a marginal person, so you can find ways to avoid that issue, but also kind of encouraging the interpreter to explain some of these emotional words more clearly to you. And that's a wonderful thing when you work with somebody who has time, who can explain to you and say, oh, this is what it means, but it also can suggest this. So, but I have found that I'm able to do that better when I have a better connection with the interpreter. When it's very fast, sometimes I just get more the meaning of the word, not so much the other part. But no, it can be really good if you have that as connection with them.
Yeah, and I'll just highlight, I think one of the resources that we've developed at the TCRC really speaks to working with interpreters, and we'll give that information at the end of the presentation, but really highlighting best practices like Martine said about meeting with the interpreter before and after. So to prep them for the session, see what you're going to give, debrief afterwards, and really just like Martine said, like what was going on with the hands? Were there nonverbals in the room that really maybe speaks more to about what's happening, and also caregiver capacity. So I encourage you to look at that resource. Thank you, Martine, for highlighting those. And always, of course, using an interpreter when possible.
And can I just say one more thing too, Alicia? I think the shift to quality over quantity. So thinking about how that before and after moment with an interpreter or cultural broker, and then having the session at a pace that makes sense so that everyone is getting the same information. I think there's such a rush for assessment information to plug into, get diagnoses and plug into forms. And so if there's a way to kind of slow that process down, it sort of allows more opportunity for culturally informed and sensitive interactions. Just feels important to highlight and say.
100%. Thank you so much. I was going to say the quality versus quantity, and then I started rushing. So thank you for slowing us down. So important. I was like feeling anxious to get all the questions, but if we don't get to all the questions, we'll send the responses in our follow-up email. So along with the question we just had, somebody posed the question, are there translations of the questions for the CFI for bilingual therapists?
I think there are, but I haven't seen them. The creator of the cultural formulation, actually, he's Puerto Rican, Roberto Luis Fernandez. So I imagine that he has one. I know that so I can try to ask him if there is one, if there's any translation. Just one talking about rushing. One thing that I didn't tell you, that I didn't say, is that I believe completely what Alicia said about quality. And sometimes what we do is use the cultural formulation to overlap with the assessments. And I didn't show you guys that slide, but I'm sure that it will be given to you guys later, in which the questions of the assessment kind of overlap with the cultural formulation in the outline of the cultural formulation. So hopefully that would allow you to kind of follow through with getting more quality.
Yes, exactly. So I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. Another question that came through was, are you able to use the CFI for just clinical work, or could that extend to immigration and asylum evaluations as well?
It can be used for all these purposes. I'm a clinician, so I emphasize my clinical work, and that's what I try to do. But I think it can complement your forensic work or school work, and by giving it more depth, by giving it a deeper understanding of what's going on. And there's an interesting study about the cultural formulation. For example, that basically talking about quantity and quality again, that even though it may take you a few more minutes to complete an assessment asking these questions, in the long run, people, when you administer the cultural formulation, people feel more understood, and they tend to return more often to you because they feel like you're heard. So this impact is not only in the clinical process, so it can be I think it happens also for when you're doing forensic work or you're doing school work.
Yeah, I agree. I've actually heard it being used in evaluations as well. One last question. specific to the CFI, and any suggestions for using that in the school settings?
I think what I would do is I would use the informant version with the teachers and the parents, and I would use some of the adaptive questions that I offered, suggested to you guys today, which I didn't kind of explain too much. But if you looked at the slides, they were like the formal questions and then the proposed ones for kids. Use those with the kids in school settings, and it may be really you might get a lot of information. Um, the other thing that I would do is it's an ongoing process. Remember what happened when I asked Dora about the causes? Yeah, the shooting's pretty clear, but then she told me it was brujeria, and so you get a deeper understanding of what's going on as you are humble, and this is really important as you try to listen and listen to them carefully without having all these stereotypical ideas of who they may be. That might be the best way to help and listen to each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to extend, we're at our time. I'm going to just say thank you again to Amy and Martine for sharing their expertise. This has been amazing. Thank you to all of you for taking your time to stay with us. As a reminder, in the coming days after today's session, you'll be receiving an email with a copy of the slides, a link to the recording, and if you're a social worker or a psychologist, you'll get information about CEUs. It has been a pleasure to offer this training series to all. Thank you for your continued commitment to providing the best possible care to our immigrant and refugee youth and families. Take care. Until we meet again, be well. Enjoy your day.